Coming up on today's episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we kick off Conrail Week by talking about Conrail as it exists today. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who's just one step closer to being a highly trained broadcast specialist. And I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And it is great, as always, to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So it is Conrail Week. That's right, Conrail Week, because you are seeing this on April 1st, 2024, which is 48 years after Conrail, the Consolidated Rail Corporation, began its operations. Now, if you are watching us on CP5 Cam, take a look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and you will see we've gone all out, because that is, in fact, CP5 itself, the signal box that was there and actually still is there to control the movements in the area, which include crossovers and now includes connection to the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railway. Now, why are we going so crazy about Conrail? Well, first of all, because Conrail was very much a revolution in terms of railroading. Never before had the U.S. government put together an entire railroad. Now, it had created Amtrak and it had built the Alaska Railroad, but what is different is that Amtrak, at the time of its creation, did not own any tracks and it didn't own any equipment. And all of its operations were being conducted by existing host railroads. In the case of the Alaska Railroad, the U.S. government built that from scratch. But in this instance, what Conrail was the melding of many assets, but not all, of a variety of bankrupt railroads. That was primarily Penn Central and Erie-Lackawanna, but it also included the Reading, Jersey Central, Lehigh Valley, and a few smaller carriers, some of which actually weren't even bankrupt, but they were associated in some form or another with the larger carriers. But today we are not talking about the history of Big Conrail. We will be getting to that in the next episode. We are talking about Conrail as it currently exists, and it currently exists as what are called shared asset areas in North Jersey, South Jersey, and Detroit. These areas allow both CSX and Norfolk Southern, who are the owners of Conrail, to access these areas and provide shipping options to all of the customers located there. The other interesting thing about Conrail is that's not all it is. It also is the majority owner of the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad, which is one of the belt lines that surrounds the city of Chicago, and is own in its own right, is one of the most significant switching carriers in the entire United States rail network, as well as Canada. Now, let's get to a little bit of Conrail as it is today. The first thing I want to do is go back a little bit to how we got where we are. We're not talking about the creation of Big Conrail here. We're talking about how Conrail was divided. Now, for 20 years, from 1976 through 1996, Conrail did its job. It operated trains across a 12-mile network that stretched from New Jersey and Massachusetts in the east to Illinois and Missouri in the west. And to be clear, their track ended in East St. Louis, Illinois. Like many railroads from the east, they didn't actually own a lot of trackage in Missouri itself. The trackage around St. Louis largely is operated by the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis, and this is another arrangement that allows a variety of carriers to enter the St. Louis area and serve a lot of the customers, not to mention interchange with each other. Now, on October 15th, 1996, the railroad and really stock market world overall, Wall Street, was rocked when CSX and Conrail announced that they would be combining in what is called a merger of equals. Now, the idea of the merger of equals is, while a lot of companies will merge in some form, in most cases those mergers are really a takeover of one by the other. And a lot of that has to do not only with how it is legally organized, but also with who ends up sharing power as time goes on. And as you can expect, as companies get a lot larger, who ends up being in charge is a big deal, especially when you have two publicly traded companies like CSX and Conrail were. This was not a situation where an owner was getting a little bit older and decided he wanted to sell out. which is something like we believe happened with Pan Am Railways and CSX a couple of years ago when Tim Mellon decided he would leave, or even with Montana Rail Link, where they turned back in their leases of BNSF trackage to BNSF itself and left because the Washington family elected not to continue operating the railroad. In this instance, two very large, vibrant shareholder-owned companies were going to combine. And a lot of this had to do with many of the machinations that had gone on over decades, really going back to the 1950s, which talked about how they were actually going to arrange the assets of the Northeast. And we all know Penn Central didn't work out. That led to the creation of Conrail. Now, let me stop here for a second and give you a little view into what it was like in those days from none other than David M. Levan himself. And David M. Levan was, of course, the final CEO of the independent Conrail. So I'm getting this queued up so that you can see Mr. Levan, and here he is in his own words. So let's get him on the screen for you, and I will click play. And for those of you who are not watching on CP5 Cam, we will have the link to this video in the description.
Since that time on the litigation front, we last week jointly with the CSX filed a counterclaim against the NS, and I think all the information about that is available too. I see my lawyers out there. Maybe I'm not properly framing all the appropriate coming close, he says. Obviously, since the last time I was here, we've had the first CSX tender offer that was successfully completed. We have now set the shareholders meeting for December the 23rd, and the second CSX tender offer has commenced, subject to obviously the vote of the Conrail shareholders in the meeting on the 23rd. One other thing that we talked briefly about in the last meeting was the importance that the new company have a new name that really represents what it is, that the vision that we have for this new enterprise, and I'm happy to say that we have started the process. We have engaged a firm to help us with that, to start the process of developing the new name for this enterprise, and I think hopefully, Arnie, we're on a plan to finish that sometime early in next year.
Now, that should tell you a little bit about what it was like in the 1990s. And we're not just talking about the fashions, but in the 1990s when CSX and Conrail were planning to merge, and then Norfolk Southern said, oh no way you're going to be able to do that without us. And they decided to get involved by offering more money to Conrail shareholders. And this produced a very much a real battle that played out in front of the media, on Wall Street, and you name it. Conrail, suddenly railroads overall, but Conrail in particular, was one of the most talked about things, both casually as well as among rail enthusiasts, employees, and investors. And so this was really a big deal in terms of rearranging the railroad map. And what I also want to point out is something that I didn't even know until I started doing the research for this episode, which was that Conrail and CSX had even planned to put together a new name for the combined entity. Now, to be clear, we don't know if that would have come out had the merger gone off in some form as was intended by Mr. Levan and also John W. Snow, who was the head of CSX at that time. Because as we've seen from a variety of corporate mergers, and some of which took place at the same time, most notably Daimler Chrysler, a lot of times some of this ends up being very much happy talk that the somebody ends up brushing aside once all the paperwork is signed, and decisions are going to be made by a different group of people than those who thought they were going to be in charge. So we're not really sure how things would have gone for Mr. Levan and the former Conrail executives had that original plan come about. But in the end, we know what ended up happening, and that was a division of Conrail's assets. And so this meant that 58% of Conrail ended up going to Norfolk Southern, who was the challenger, while 42% of Conrail was going to CSX, which was supposed to be the ideal partner for the company. And Also remember this. One of the reasons, or I should say the biggest reason why Conrail was so sought after by both CSX and Norfolk Southern is because it controlled the majority of access to the New York City area, which includes North Jersey. And that's a big deal because it is America's largest consumer market. And for a long time, both CSX and Norfolk Southern felt that they did not have much in the way of access to the market. Now, one of the big ways they tried to do this was actually through the New York, Susquehanna, and Western. And we will give you a link to the episode we did on designated operators because they ended up bolstering the New York, Susquehanna, and Western, which was a roughly 500-mile short line that only owned about 300 miles of its track. In the area so that they could utilize that as a way to get their hands on the Delaware and Hudson, which interestingly enough, Norfolk Southern had previously controlled until it sold to Timothy Mellon and Guilford Rail System in the early 1980s. So they could get their hands on it, and that way the combination of the Delaware and Hudson and the NYS&W would have granted them access through operating rights that the Delaware and Hudson had into the New York market, and therefore they would be able to serve it and break up what is deemed by many as being a monopoly for Conrail. To be clear, Conrail did not have a monopoly. What Conrail did have, though, was the majority of rail lines that went into the region, and therefore they were the primary rail operator that went there. There were other railroads in the area. Some of them were short lines that received track that were sold by Conrail or never became part of Conrail in the first place. And the other thing you cannot forget is that not only was there substantial and still remains marine traffic that goes in the area, but you also had, of course, highway, which meant trucking. And I say all of this because there tends to be a very myopic view of how railroading is, especially now that we have relatively few Class 1 rail carriers, which, of course, are the largest rail carriers. And the idea that somehow, quote unquote, competitive rail service is not being provided because, Norfolk Southern is the only railroad that goes here or CSX is the only railroad that goes there. No, railroads are just one part of the transportation network overall. And what you have is one rail provider in many cases. And that was the case with Conrail. But as we know, the attempt to meld the Delaware and Hudson and the New York, Susquehanna, and Western did not work. Canadian Pacific ended up getting that, and therefore this ended up everybody being back to wanting to get into the Northeast. Now, you're probably wondering, but Phil, didn't you say that not too long ago, the Norfolk Southern controlled the Delaware and Hudson, but they sold it? Yes. Not only that, but NS predecessor, Norfolk and Western, controlled the Erie-Lackawanna, and they let that go too, and it's how it became part of Conrail, and also how Conrail got to be as large as it was. What's more, there were chances, and we will get into this as we go on throughout Conrail Week, that a lot of these other carriers, including the Chesapeake and Ohio, the N&W, and so forth, had the ability to access the New York market by purchasing some of these bankrupt carriers or asserting control that they already have. But many of you probably realize this. One of the things that a lot of companies disdain doing is taking over distressed assets. Distressed asset plays, and that is a situation where a company might be bankrupt or there might be a large overdue mortgage on a particular property. In those cases, it's considered to be distressed by Wall Street. Now, a lot of companies don't like to take over these assets because what ends up happening is that you get a lot of liabilities or other obligations that you wouldn't otherwise want. And now think about this. Before Conrail was created, you had the Reading, the Jersey Central, and the Erie-Lackawanna, all of whom offered very valuable access to what was then still the nation's largest consumer market. But because they not only were heavily indebted and also operated a lot of commuter trains, which lost money, although they were being subsidized in ways, these larger carriers from outside the region most certainly wanted that distress to go away. So that was one thing that Conrail did. Big Conrail did, is it ended the distress of these distressed properties and rehabilitated them to the point where they did once again become value. And that's how we ended up with a situation where a railroad that had an operating ratio over 80, and I just realized this again in doing some research for this episode, at the end, Big Conrail had an operating ratio over 80, and I believe it was close to 83. Whereas Norfolk Southern and CSX had operating ratios in the 70s, which is, to put it in perspective, just think an operating ratio over 80 means that 80 cents of every dollar that it took in went to expenses. So just think about if you go to work and you had to spend 80 cents out of every dollar on things you don't want to spend it on, you wouldn't really be all that enthusiastic about working. So it's not to say that Conrail was poorly run. It had other factors, most notably its territory, why the operating ratio would be higher. So I don't want you to go out and say, well, Phil said bad things about the people who ran Conrail, because they did a very, very good job in putting that company together and keeping it going. But under normal circumstances, something wouldn't be like that, wouldn't be valued as highly as it was. But at the end of the day, what started as a merger transaction where shareholders would receive $92.50 per Conrail share plus 1.8 shares of CSX. So they would have gotten cash plus a share and almost 2 shares of CSX for their stock, ended up receiving $115 in cash from CSX and Norfolk Southern together. And that's how we got here. Now, one thing that is very interesting, after May 23rd, 1999, everybody started crying and we said Conrail is gone and life is going to be so different. Well, it wasn't quite gone. In fact, what Conrail did is it actually created 2 limited liability companies, and you might have heard of them, New York Central Lines LLC and Pennsylvania Lines LLC, which of course harkens back to the pre-Penn Central era of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad. New York Central Lines LLC held the 42% of Conrail that was being allocated to CSX. And so this primarily consisted of rail routes, but also consisted of rail cars. Now, in the case of Norfolk Southern, they took over Pennsylvania Lines LLC, which had locomotives and rail routes, and it does not appear that Norfolk Southern put rail cars into the LLC, but instead held them directly. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because between 1999 and 2004, Conrail remained the owner of these properties, and CSX and Norfolk Southern, despite being the owners of Conrail, were actually only operating and managing those properties as opposed to owning them and controlling them directly. Now, for you and I, as rail enthusiasts out there with our cameras, it's a distinction without a difference, but from a legal standpoint and also from a regulatory standpoint, it very much did matter. And that also meant that certain decisions that were being made related to these assets, for example, if, as I had hoped, Norfolk Southern looked at some of the former Erie-Lackawanna routes and said, you know what, this doesn't really fit with what we want to do. We'd like to sell them. And I was certainly trying to buy them at that point. They would have had to work through this framework in order to accomplish it. So it wasn't something that could just be automatically done. Now, that's not to say that these sort of things were impossible, but keep in mind, this is somewhat like having a business partner, even though the goal was actually to compete against that other company that was effectively their business partner in the case of Norfolk Southern and CSX. But by 2004, this knot was unwound when they had the final spin transactions, and you saw PRR and NYC go away for a second time. Now, what you might remember, for those of you who are rail enthusiasts, and you still will see this, there are a fair amount of rail cars running around, and they have NYC reporting marks. These are the actual New York Central, as in Big Al Pearlman, Gustav Metzman, Commodore Vanderbilt, New York Central. That is the reporting marks that Conrail did have, which it received from Penn Central, and of course the original New York Central itself. But those cars, or at least the majority of those cars, are actually CSX cars that formerly were part of Conrail. Likewise, Norfolk Southern for many years did use the PRR reporting marks on the locomotives it acquired from Conrail. So you would see something like an SD50 or a GP38-2, GP40-2 running around with PRR reporting marks. And keep in mind, also, Norfolk Southern has been very big for years on using the sublettering on its locomotives, and it's how you can see things like CNOTP for the Cincinnati, New Orleans, Texas Pacific, the AGS, Alabama Great Southern, CG for Central Georgia, and then, of course, they added PRR for Pennsylvania Lines LLC. But 2004 comes, these spin transactions happen, and that brings an end to that era. So, where does Conrail stand today? Well, first of all, it still exists just like it used to. It is based in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, which is not that far across the river from Philadelphia, where it used to be based. It was Big Conrail was over at 2 Commerce Square, but originally at 6 Penn Center, which had been Penn Central's headquarters. It has since moved from its original location in Mount Laurel, which was on Howard Boulevard, to another address, which I can't remember off the top of my head here, but that's where it is based, and that's where it is operated from. Now, it is operating, as I mentioned at the top of the show, these 3 shared asset areas: North Jersey, South Jersey, and Detroit. And the purpose of the shared asset areas was simple. Because remember, the idea of dividing Conrail between CSX and Norfolk Southern was predicated upon creating more competition in the Northeast Railroad scene than had existed in 20 years. Until, of course, since Conrail had been created. That was the rationale they used to sell this to the regulators and politicians and so forth, who were very, very much engaged in the process. And as part of that effort that I mentioned earlier to purchase some of the former Erie-Lackawanna lines from originally Conrail and later Norfolk Southern, I did, my grandmother and I actually went down to one of the hearings that was held in Washington, D.C. for the Conrail division. And I remember getting on the Metroliner and going down. It was the first and only time I rode the Metroliner. Because obviously, not being a business traveler when I was a teenager, you tended not to ride the most expensive train out there. It was a Metroliner down, and I do believe it was the Montrealer to return, because that's before the Montrealer had been discontinued. But it was very interesting to see all of the people who were so heavily involved. And one of the ones I remember most notably was Gerald Nadler, who is still a congressman from the state of New York and represents a portion of New York City. He and the NIT League, so I think it was National something Transportation League, they were just 2 of the many parties who were weighing in aggressively on what was happening, because there was, on one hand, a lot of satisfaction and enthusiasm that you were going to see more than one big railroad in the Northeast. But then at the same time, there was a lot of concern, because while you were going to see more than one big railroad, you were going to see an end to the days of what Conrail used to do, which was being able to divide a lot of the traffic that comes out of the Northeast between CSX and Norfolk Southern. It was going to be up to them to fight for that traffic. And so one of the ways they did that was by creating the shared asset areas. And what the shared asset areas do is these are operated by Conrail itself, which is what's left over from Big Conrail. But every customer that's located there can pick either CSX or Norfolk Southern to do the long distance travel. And so that way you will see a lot of situations where both carriers will fight with each other for particular contracts with individual shippers, and that way they will be able to get more business or otherwise. That's also why you see in some instances, sometimes, especially with bulk traffic and so on, moving into the Northeast, that, well, it'll be operating on NS for a while, but then later on CSX will get it. And that's because one railroad loses the contract to the other. And that is just the sort of thing that you see in the shared asset areas. Now, I want to be clear. Some people might look at this and say, well, hey, this is a great idea because it shows that open access works. And for those who are uninitiated, open access is simply removing the barriers toward any railroad to use any particular piece of track to serve customers. Now, here in America, railroads think that is a terrible idea. I happen to agree with them, because what it's going to amount to is a taking of existing railroad property. Majority of our railroads, even though there were government subsidies involved at various times, were largely built with private capital and have been maintained with private capital for over a century, and it's actually closer to 2 centuries. Yeah, actually closer to 3 centuries as I think about it. And being able to take that property away and all the investment that's gone into it, just so that somebody else, even if that somebody else was me, could come along and say, hey, look, I'll come along and serve you. That represents a taking of the investment that was put in by those companies over many, many years. And remember, as we like to remind you here at the All Aboard podcast, don't look at companies as being a monolithic thing, the way that many of the anti-free market folks will tell you. Look at companies as being a large group of people, and most of those people are you and I, who are small individual investors who put our money into those companies. And so, and also as people who bank and therefore have our money invested in the form of loans in these companies, because lending is in a way a form of investment. So that very much should matter to us, especially with the large capital needs that a railroad would have. This what Conrail is different than open access, because what it is both of these companies are sharing access to these shippers. So you have a choice of two. You don't have a choice of anybody who would just happen along. However, what we have learned over the years in railroading is at times it will be advantageous to have others come in, and we're actually seeing a lot of that now that the CPKC merger has taken place, and CSX and Norfolk Southern are now jockeying for traffic that will be moving into Texas from the southeast. And so we'll do more on that in future episodes, but that is an example of how railroads tend to continue to be competitive in the free market sense without regulation actually imposing it on them. And to be clear, the shared assets were not imposed on the railroads by the regulators. That was very much a result of the free market problem of how do we both get in here and have success. Now, in the case of, just to give you some examples, so in Detroit, you've got customers like Chrysler, Detroit Edison, Ford, General Motors. All of those made big sense for both CSX and Norfolk Southern to serve. Both of them actually did already serve some of them, but in other cases, they wanted to serve them in a much larger way. So that gives you an example of how the shared asset model does work. So let's go over and give you an example of what these shared asset areas look like today. And to do that, I'm going to give you a look at a PowerPoint that was put together by Conrail itself, and it talks about how things have changed and what the company currently looks like. And the first I'm going to show you here is the North Jersey Shared Asset Area. Now that is, of course, very important to us because I'm from North Jersey. It's the area that I know and I've seen the best, so we'll enlarge that a little bit for you. And here are some facts about the North Jersey Shared Assets Area. Now, it includes Conrail's combined main line that runs from North Bergen, which was Pennsylvania Railroad's Meadows Yard, to Port Reading, New Jersey, where the Trenton line and the Lehigh line began. And that is noteworthy. Back in the days of Big Conrail, you had these two lines join there, and then they would kind of snake their way up toward Oak Island Yard and then north toward the River Line, as well as the Southern Tier Line. This is what Big Conrail did over the years, that melded parts of the railroads that became, or the assets that became part of it, in order to make a unified route. Now, the centerpiece of this area is the former Lehigh Valley Oak Island Yard, but Conrail also reaches Croxton Yard, and it serves both the Port of New York and New Jersey, which Port Newark Container Terminal, Port Elizabeth, and so on. And I would be remiss if I did not get you one of my favorite pictures and tell you a little story here about these two. Now, I was very lucky back when I worked for Go Rail to take a trip, which I did not expect to get, on this train that you see there, and that is CSX F40PH 9999. Behind it is the 9998, the second pair of F40s that CSX acquired. And then you see three gentlemen in front there, and the bald guy in the middle, that is Jim Simpson, who at the time was Transportation Secretary for Governor Chris Christie. Now, the story here is, when I was working for Go Rail, I get this invitation in the mail, and it says you're invited to come and ride this train. And now I had been working New Jersey for Go Rail, so I'd gotten to know a fair amount of the railroad folks who worked in New Jersey with CSX, Norfolk Southern, and so on, and I attended the short line meetings and so on, and so that's probably how I got on the list. And I said, there is no way that my bosses would let me go on this trip. So of course what I did was I made sure to not tell them I was going on that trip, and so I planned a week travel all around that, because that took place on a Friday. And we went to a yard that was, I'm trying to remember exactly where it was, but it was a little bit closer to Ridgefield Park. Got on the train, and I rode in CSX, at the time was CSX's New York, which was a car that actually at one point had carried Queen Elizabeth when she had come to visit the United States, and went through the Bergen Hill Tunnel, which had been rehabilitated by Conrail using federal funds. So there are actually a lot of public officials around. I had a good conversation with Clarence Gooden, who at the time was the chief commercial officer of CSX and had started his career with the Atlantic coastline. And I couldn't believe when I asked him, so, well, when did you get in the rail business? Yeah, I joined the Atlantic coastline. And keep in mind, this is 2010. The Atlantic coastline by that point had not been around since 1967. So that gives you an idea of how long Clarence Gooden had been part of the seaboard Atlantic coastline, seaboard system, CSX family there. And it was truly a magical experience. And of course, if you ever get a chance to ride on the executive train, I always caution you to do the most important thing, which is this, which I did. And for those of you who are on CP5 cam, there is my handsome face just about, I think, what are we at? About 15 years ago, 15 years ago, inside the car. So that way you can prove you were on the executive train. And that's why you want to make sure you take your picture there. But it was a great opportunity to see Conrail up close and personal and to see all of what they did, where they served, and that included Port Newark and Port Elizabeth terminals, where both CSX and Norfolk Southern have built a very, very strong presence. And since we're talking about container terminals, Conrail actually expanded. And this came about in 2007 when CSX and Norfolk Southern reached an agreement with Staten Island and the Port of New York and New Jersey to extend service over the former Staten Island Rapid Transit, which was previously known as the Staten Island Railway under the Delaware Otsego Corporation, to the Howland Hook Marine Terminal. And this is where they're now taking containers in and out of there, in addition to Port Newark and Port Elizabeth. So that service is operated by Conrail for CSX and Norfolk Southern, and therefore represents a chance or an example of where Conrail has actually grown in the time since it lost the majority of its operation through the division. And now, of course, Conrail does continue to host passenger traffic, most notably New Jersey Transit trains that are operating between the Hunter connection on the Northeast Corridor and the Aldine connection. So basically, this allows trains that once operated on the Central Railroad of New Jersey, which New Jersey Transit calls its Raritan Valley Line, and once went into the Jersey City terminal that's still in existence at Liberty State Park. They are now able to go to Penn Station in New York City and Newark Penn Station, and then get on to the Lehigh Valley, which then gets them on the Lehigh Valley, the Lehigh Line, which is a Conrail route, and then gets them on to New Jersey Transit's Raritan Valley Line proper to go to their destinations in the northwestern part of the state. Now, moving on to the South Jersey shared asset area, and let me just get that up here for you so you can see what we're talking about. The South Jersey shared asset area is based on the Pavonia Yard is the primary area there where you'll see them operating out of. And this contains a lot of the former Pennsylvania Reading seashore lines. And there you go. For those of you who are on CP5 cam, you can see a lot of the Pennsylvania Reading seashore lines trackage in South Jersey. So we're talking about, at one point, Palermo, Millville, Carneys Point. Carneys Point is notable because that is the location of DuPont. Yes, DuPont, Chambers Cogeneration, and also Atlantic City Electric. So those are large customers that CSX and Norfolk Southern both would like to serve and win contracts periodically. It also operates over New Jersey Transit's River Line using temporal separation. And temporal separation, just in case you haven't seen this in the past, that is when certain trains are allowed to operate over certain rail lines. Now, when it comes to transit, most transit vehicles, and we're talking about your streetcars, your trolleys, your light rail vehicles, the majority of them are not built to FRA standards, which means there is the possibility that in the event it collides with what we call a traditional train, such as your General Electric Dash 8, Dash 9, EMD SD70M, something like that, that there would be certainly substantially more damage that would take place to the light rail vehicle or the streetcar than would the train. And so therefore, the Federal Railroad Administration typically does not allow cars that do not meet its strength standards to operate on those lines without some kind of arrangements. And the arrangement that was selected here when Conrail sold the portion, and let me just put that back here, which goes up from roughly Trenton all the way down here to Hatch, was the Bordentown Secondary, sold it to New Jersey DOT and New Jersey Transit for construction of the River Line. They said, well, if you're going to do this, we have to have temporal separation, which means in certain hours, you're allowed to operate the passenger trains, which in this case are diesel-powered light rail vehicles, and then at other times, you're allowed to operate the freight trains over the same route, but the times cannot coincide. And this way, there's no possibility that a freight train would end up colliding or otherwise interacting with the River Line light rail vehicles. Another example of this also took place in Baltimore until the mid-2000s, when Conrail had sold off what remained of the Northern Central to the Maryland Department of Transportation, and that's where they constructed the northern portion of their streetcar routes. And that, until I believe it was 07, 08, somewhere in there, had service being provided by Conrail first and then Norfolk Southern later after the division to serve a variety of customers that were on that route. So again, temporal separation. So there was no chance you're going to see a train in the midday a freight train, unless something gone dramatically wrong. And then you wouldn't be allowed to have the passenger services taking place. So this is the South Jersey shared asset area. And if you go over to our trackside videos channel on the All Aboard podcast channel here, you will see a couple of videos that we took in December of the Conrail special that I operated down to Haddon Heights, New Jersey, where one of the former Conrail E8s, number 5711, was 4021 under Conrail, but 5711 on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and now on Juniata Terminal, that's its owner, operated out with a train to Haddon Heights for employee appreciation. And it was great. There were plenty of rail fans there, in addition to, of course, the employees who the train was really being run for in the first place. And it was the first time in years that one of those E8s of Juniata Terminal, which is owned by Bennett Levin, had operated on its own. And that was due to positive train control and the fact that Juniata Terminal has not installed that equipment in its E8 units. Now, the South Jersey shared asset area interchanges with the Southern Railroad of New Jersey, the Winchester and Western's New Jersey operations, and Cape May Seashore lines. It also interchanges with the Chesapeake and Delaware, as portions of that network have been spun off to what is a very fast-growing enterprise. Now, moving on to Detroit, because Detroit is also a critical portion of Conrail, and I should note that it's interesting, they do in fact serve two Trentons, so Trenton, New Jersey, and also Trenton, Michigan. And here you go. You see here the Livernois Yard, as well as Detroit North, Sterling, CP Town Line, and then Trenton, Michigan. Now, some of the customers here include the famous River Rouge plant of Ford Motor Company. Also, let's see, GM's Hamtramck, Michigan plant, which is now producing electric vehicles, Marathon Oil, and one that I haven't been able to fully understand, but I will do a little bit of more research on and get back to you here, and that is the Michigan Liquor Control Commission. They also have a spur off of the Detroit shared asset area. But again, you get an idea when you look at those large customers, as well as Detroit Edison, which is the major utility in the area, of why it was necessary to make this into a shared asset area. Now, if you thought we were done, we're not, because Conrail has one other property that's somewhat important, and it's called the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad. And we want to show you this picture because I think you're going to find this very interesting, given some of the conversations that we've had, especially as it goes to unique locomotives. But this is IHB, and there you see IHB number 4010, which is a former Southern Pacific GP40P-2 that is part of the Indiana Harbor Belt roster. But the IHB is a 54-mile mainline track route that has 54 miles of mainline track, but it has 266 miles of yard tracks and sidings, and it serves 160 customers. Now, it also operates over the former Conrail Chicago line as far as Burns Harbor because it recently abandoned its trackage. To say recently, I mean mid 2010s, abandoned its trackage there. Burns Harbor is one of the most important locations on the Great Lakes because it has become a major shipping port. A lot of steel there. You see several steel plants located there. And if you take any of Amtrak's services that run along the Chicago line, which includes the Michigan trains as well as the Lakeshore and Capital Limiteds, you'll see exactly how industrial an area that Burns Harbor is. Conrail is the 51% owner of the Indiana Harbor Belt. The other 49% is owned by CPKC, which came about through the Soo Line, which is CPKC, one of its subsidiaries, primary U.S. subsidiary, aside from, of course, the Kansas City Southern. And that the Soo inherited from the Milwaukee Road because it purchased the majority of the Milwaukee Road's rail assets in the 1980s, which is what brought an end to that famed carrier there. Now, as I mentioned, Conrail's headquarters now in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and it has 566 route miles of trackage on its own. And that is a picture of Conrail today. So on Wednesday, we will be back to talk about Conrail of yesterday. And that's where we will talk about everything big Conrail, from bicentennial painted GG1s to operating GP40Ps and E8s to serving coal customers to trail van trains to mail trains to my time at CP5 and how we got there. So what I hope you'll do is share your memories of Conrail in the comments. I'd love to hear it because Conrail was such an important railroad that made such an important impact on not only the rail industry, but industry overall. And it is something that's going to be discussed for decades to come. So I want to make sure that you are on the record with that as well. As always, please shoot me an email, info@allaboard.media. And finally, we will have in the description a link to our new Telegram channel. We want you to follow us on Telegram. It's a lot of fun over there, and it's more fun if more of you are a part of it. We'll see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.